bringing us over. I found it really interesting and actually really helpful to hear what you've been doing here. It's given me a lot of things to think about in the kinds of challenges that we're facing at the moment. So thank you for that. In terms of what I want to do in this paper is really to give you an overview of some of the different ways in which digital humanities methods are being applied in my own field of study, which is the history of crime in England, but specifically within London, between 1700 and 1900. I'm in particular going to be looking at what you might call the more advanced end of the spectrum. So this is the kind of boundary pushing uses of digital methods. You could say we're all on a digital spectrum, we all use computers to some extent, we're all digital and whatever we are, but it is a spectrum, and I'm looking more at the kind of advanced end of the spectrum. And I'm going to be looking at kind of 4 approaches in particular. And what I hope to do in the process is address the Dean's question this morning, which I think is an important and a good one, and that's why do we approach things digitally? Is it actually adding anything to what we can find out? Is it adding to our store of knowledge? Is it an advantage? Is it a benefit? Those kinds of things. I think I consider myself, if you can be such a thing, a kind of sceptical convert to digital humanities. I'm not sure if that's physically possible, intellectually possible. I believe that it can make a real difference and it can produce new findings, but I'm also very conscious of the fact that in some cases it hasn't. And people talk about it having an effect when it maybe doesn't. So that's the way in which I'm kind of approaching the subject. Anyway, on to the different kinds of methods that I'm going to be looking at. So the first of these then is distant reading. So as historians at least, and I imagine also if you're literary scholars instead, we tend to focus in the most part, on close readings of texts. We look at a single example, a single text of something, and we read it closely, we read it intently, and we try and find all its nuances in that particular one text. And so, for one example, if we wanted to learn about the history of crime and policing in London in the 18th and 19th centuries, one of the texts that we could look at closely is the Old Bailey Proceedings. Has anyone heard of the Old Bailey Proceedings before? Some nods? Yeah. Okay, so the Old Bailey Proceedings were printed accounts of the trials that took place at London's Central Criminal Court between 1674 and 1913. They're very well known amongst historians of crime, and historians of crime for a long time have been doing close readings of these documents to find out about the history of their subject. But the information that we get from the Old Bailey Proceedings, from those printed accounts of the trials, is obviously shaped by the nature of the trial accounts themselves. It's shaped by the nature of the record, and that didn't necessarily stay the same over time. The nature of the proceedings as a source changes over time. So how do we understand that? How do we understand that change over time? We could try and read every single printed account of the trials in a close reading, but there are nearly 200,000 trial accounts. That's 127 million words. It's a lifetime's work. One individual couldn't possibly read every single trial account closely. So what we might do then is do a distant reading of the proceedings, to step back and try and see the whole set of 200,000 trial accounts in their entirety in one go. That's made possible by the digitisation of the Old Bailey Proceedings, by the Old Bailey Proceedings online. I'll just bring up the website. Yep, so the Old Bailey Proceedings online has digitised all 200,000 printed trial accounts, and they can be keyword searched. There are lots of other ways in which you can search the records and that kind of thing. So we might try then doing a distant reading of that digitised collection of Old Bailey trials. And that's what Tim Hitchcock and William Turkle have recently done. They've taken the data from the Old Bailey proceedings online and they've done a distant reading of those trial accounts. And that's produced some really interesting and important findings. So one thing that they did is just look at how many words were published for each trial account over time. Now, you might be able to see it, but down at the bottom here, this is year of publication, year of trial, so we have 1700 here, 1900 here. We have the number of trials per year up here, and then on the right-hand axis we have the number of words per year. Okay, so the red line is essentially the number of words that were published in the Old Bailey proceedings each year. And what you can see is there's a huge spike in the kind of 1820s in the numbers of words printed per year. So what that means is that for the 1820s onwards, or certainly between the 1820s and the 1840s, is that trials are simply much better documented than they are at any other time. That surely changes how we use the proceedings, how we understand them as a source. We know a lot more here than we do here. It's a simple fact, but it might not be obvious when we're looking at things closely. So that was one thing that they did, was just look at the number of words published in each trial account over time. Another thing that they did is to look at how the lengths of the trial accounts varied from trial to trial. So were some trials covered in more detail than others? And the answer is yes, by a significant degree. So again, we've got the year of the trial at the bottom, and then we have the trial length in words, so how many words that particular trial was reported in. And each dot is effectively a single trial account. So what we can see, generally, is that in the 18th century, so up to about here, there's quite a similarity. The trials are reported, generally speaking, in a similar number of words, particularly in the early 18th century. And then what happens in the 19th century is you get this kind of bifold pattern. Some trials are reported in a lot of detail, there's no middle ground really, and then there's a kind of another section of trials that are reported in very little detail. So what's going on here? Why have we got the development of this split, this twofold pattern? What happens here is the introduction of plea bargaining in trials. So defendants come before the court and they say, this is the charge, and the defendant says, yes, I'm guilty, essentially. And so the trials aren't being covered in any detail because they're very short, so they're not happening. And then we have the other trials where essentially the defendant is contesting the trial. So what this reveals is the development of the trial, the nature of the trial itself, as much as the nature of how those trials are being reported. So that's the kind of example of how we might use distant reading for some sources. What it allows us to do, its overall value, is to explore a body of text that would be so big that no one individual could read it in its entirety. It doesn't replace close reading, but it does, I think, add to it. And what we need then is a kind of balance between close and distance reading, and movement between those two levels. Okay, so moving on then. So with the Old Bailey proceedings, we have the digitalisation of one particular set of records, and this has tended to be, within the history of crime, within digital histories of crime, traditionally that's the way that sources have tended to be approached. They've been approached as singular units. So we have the Old Bailey proceedings as one unit, or we might have digitised collections of newspapers, or novels, for example, or KGB archives. The tendency has been to pick a particular record and digitise that record singly. And so what we're doing in effect is reproducing the structure of the archive, but in a digital form. The archival structure essentially remains the same, we can just access it through the web. So that's fine, but the problem then is that our knowledge is always going to be dictated by the nature of the archive itself. That's essentially how we're getting into the information. So in order to overcome this, and this is the kind of second digital humanities approach, if you like, that I want to focus on, is the recent trend towards what we might call federated or integrated searching. In other words, bringing together lots of different sets of digitized records and being able to search across all those sets of records at once. Essentially kind of putting across the archives, if you like. It's essentially Google, but for historical records, right? So that trend towards integrated, federated searching has been well used in things like Ancestry. Has anyone come across Ancestry or Find My Past? Kind of commercial genealogy websites? Yeah. So this is essentially how those websites work. They allow you to search across lots of different sets of records, but with the genealogy ones, it's essentially by name alone. That's the only way you can get into those records, is if you've got a specific name in mind, you can search for that name, and it will search all of its sets of records and find you that name. So that's some kind of, those sites tend to be aimed towards popular audiences, not necessarily academics, people who are investigating their own family history. But there have been, in recent years, a move towards more academic-focused websites that allow you to search across the different sets of archives. And one example of this is Connected Histories. So Connected Histories, it brings together about 25 different sets of digitized records, and it allows you to do keyword searches across those sets of records, but it also allows you to search for places and persons. So what you might do then is you could search for, if I was interested in the history of highway robbers, I could search for highwaymen, and hopefully at some point it would produce me a list of search results. There we go. So we've got some that are in illustrations, we've got some that turn up in newspapers, one turns up in the Newton Project, parliamentary records, and so on and so forth. So what we're doing then is kind of getting around those archival structures by looking for themes across different sets of records. So has this added anything to what we know about the history of crime? So I want to read a short quote from the creators of Connected Histories. They said that the creators of this website said that they hoped it would allow a crowdsourced, connected British history to develop on the web. And one of the ways that they hoped that kind of crowdsourced history would take place was through this connections section. This is essentially where users of Connected Histories, users of the website, can put up the searches that they've done and the records that they've found. So I could, for example, put up my searches for highwaymen and find all those sets of records that I found in relation to that. And there are some examples on here, but even a quick glance of what's been put up there suggests that there's not a great deal of particularly interesting or relevant stuff. There's some that have no records in them at all. There are others where they have one or two references. But if Connected Histories is a genuine attempt to create a new kind of British history, one that's created by not just me as an academic, but anyone who can access the website, and doing it in a kind of collective, collaborative way, it's difficult to see that it's really reached its potential so far. So these kind of federated search engines, things like Ancestry, Connected Histories and so on, they allow us as the user to manually make connections across the archive. But what digital technologies can do, and what we're starting to do now, is to go even further and in effect to kind of reconstruct the archive itself. To break the archive down into component parts, atomize it if you like, and then to reassemble that archive in a way that we choose, that's not dictated by an archivist or by the people that created the record at the time, but to fundamentally base that reconstruction on what am I interested in, what's my research question. And the example that I want to give of this is the Digital Panopticon project, which I was a research assistant on a few years ago. It went live in 2016. The aim of the project, the Digital Panopticon, is to reconstruct the lives of offenders who were convicted at the Old Bailey in London between 1780 and 1925. So, the problem that we have as historians, I'm a historian of crime, I'd love to know about the individual lives of convicts, what happened to them, that kind of thing. The difficulty with finding that out is that the archive of crimes weren't designed with my needs in mind. The archives of crime in the 18th and 19th centuries were fundamentally designed for the purposes of administration, to help the court system work in practice. So what that means then is that the archive tends to be broken down into things like court records, or imprisonment records, or death penalty records. That tends to be the way that the archive is split up. And a single individual might pop up in each of those sets of records, but they do so randomly, right? 18th century and 19th century contemporaries didn't care about the lives of offenders. They weren't following offenders around and mapping their histories. They were more interested in the court system and how the court system works. So if we want to find out about an individual then, a single individual, we have to try and find them in each of those sets of records, wherever they pop up randomly. But obviously, the difficulty there is that it's manually really time-consuming. How do we actually do that for tens of thousands of individuals? And that's what the Digital Panopticon tries to do. It tries to reconstruct the lives of offenders at scale, across tens of thousands of individuals. So what we did then, in order to do that, was we brought together about 50 different sets of digitised records. So one of those is the Old Bailey proceedings, which we just looked at. And then we had lots of other records, so trial records, entrances of pardons, petitions for pardon. Then we had transportation records, so for offenders who were sent to Australia, we have their records. Those who were imprisoned in the UK, we have their records. And then we also have civil records, so things like the censuses that were taken every 10 years from kind of 1841 onwards. So what the project did was to bring together those 50 different sets of records, and then we used a record linkage algorithm to find wherever a name appears, the same name across that different sets of records. So let's say John Smith, for example. It finds all the cases where John Smith, born in 1790, appears in the sets of records, and then it links those findings together, it links those results together to create what we call a life archive. And I'll show you one example, and that's Phoebe Anderson. So Phoebe Anderson appears in 10 different sets of records in the database. So we have, she appears in the Newgate calendars of prisoners, the Old Bailey proceedings, the transportation registers, and then in the records of Van Diemen's Land, that's the penal colony in Australia. So the computers found Phoebe Anderson in these 10 different sets of records, and essentially it's brought those different sets of records together in a collective. But as you can see, just from scrolling through, it's a jumble of information. There's no structure to all that information. We have 10 sets of records. We know that Phoebe appeared in those 10 sets of records, but how do we make sense of all that information? So the next stage of the project was to try and actually apply some structure to the information. And what we did was essentially create a chronological narrative for each individual, a life archive that's dictated by time. And we divided the information up into what we call life events. Major life events and minor life events. So we have here, major life event is born, it's quite a major one. So Phoebe's born in 1822. The next major event that happens to her is imprisonment. She's then tried, imprisoned as a result of her trial. She then appears shortly after being imprisoned after serving out her sentence. She was tried again at the Old Bailey, again for a similar crime, and 2 strikes and you're out. She was transported to Australia, and at that point we know various bits about her. She absconded at various points, and then we have minor life events. So she applied to marry 1845, and then she got married the following month in 1845. She has a child as well. So the rationale of the project was to create these life archives and then be able to compare those life archives across thousands of individuals. So we can start to compare Phoebe against her cohort, against other people like her. So, coming back to the Dean's question, who cares? Very interesting, and it's great to learn about Phoebe's life. What has it added to what we know about the subject of crime? I want to give one example where I think this is where we find something out that we wouldn't otherwise know, and that is really interesting to know. And my favourite example of this is Edward Wright. So, Edward Wright, he was born in 1729. He's an offender. He's an offender who appeared several times at the Old Bailey. He's a recurrent thief. He's a recidivist. And quite simply, we wouldn't have known about his repeat offending if it wasn't for the Old Bailey, through the Digital Panopticon, sorry. It's only through that process of record linkage and creating a narrative out of those linked records that we actually know about Edward's repeat offending. So just to give you a quick run through, we know that he was, from what we can tell, he was born in 1729 in Westminster in London. In October 1791, at the age of 62, he was prosecuted at the Old Bailey for stealing 2 iron buckles from a shop. The jury found him guilty, and because the crime was relatively minor, he was only sentenced to whipping. The next year, he was again before the Old Bailey, this time for stealing some bacon. This time he was sentenced to imprisonment. After serving out his term of imprisonment, he was then tried a further 9 times into his 60s and 70s. At one point, he was convicted of shoplifting, which is a relatively serious offence. He was sentenced to the death penalty, but then he actually was pardoned on condition of imprisonment. And then the last that we know about him was that at the age of 79, in 1808, his final appearance at the Old Bailey, he was found guilty, again for stealing, sentenced to a spot in the House of Correction, and at this point, at the age of the 79, apparently the clerk of the court of the Old Bailey wrote down that Wright had been tried above 70 times and was a thief all of his life. So it's only because of the Digital Panopticon that we know about Edward Wright and we know about his recidivism. It gives us a totally different perspective on the history of crime, and we can see these kinds of examples. In other words, history doesn't have to be dictated by the archives, by the structure of the archive that we've been left with. Okay, so moving on to the final kind of method approach of digital humanities. So, as historians, we tend for the most part to rely on texts. Yes, we have access to other evidence, we have images, we might have buildings, architectural evidence that's been left over, we have maps, we have objects, we have more than text, but generally speaking, 90% of the time, what we base our argument on is texts. Fine. But the text can only take us so far. So, for example, with the Old Bailey proceedings, with those printed accounts of trials, they only tell us so much. Yes, we know the words of the defendant, we know what the defendant said through the Old Bailey proceedings, but we have no sense of what the trial would have been, what the experience of the trial would have been like. We don't know how the spatial layout would have been like. We don't know how close the defendant would have been to their prosecutor. We don't know what a trial would have sounded like as those words were spoken, for example. We don't have access to a whole a whole facet of that past, of that history. So one of the things that historians of crime are now trying to do is to recover that experience, that aspect of history that isn't within the text, that goes beyond the text. And this is what Professor Tim Hitchcock at the University of Sussex is currently doing. So one of the things that he's doing is to essentially create a 3D model, reconstructed model of the Old Bailey courthouse and of how the physical layout of the courthouse changed over time by using architectural plans of the Old Bailey courthouse and looking at how those things change over time. He's also creating a sound model based on that 3D construction. So based on what we know of the physical layout of the Old Bailey, of the materials that it was made out of, we can quite literally recreate what a trial would have sounded like. We can insert the words of the Old Bailey trial into that 3D model, and then we can replay the sounds of a trial. And one of the really interesting things that when you do that is that it's long been known by historians of crime that the defendants over time said less and less and less. So from the 18th century to the 19th century, the defendant is literally silenced in the sense of they just say less at trials, and instead it's lawyers who tend to speak for them. Defendants don't really say much by the 20th century. But what's really interesting is if you look at the physical layout of the courthouse and at the sound modelling of the trial, is that defendants really do become silenced. They get pushed further and further away out of the listening area of the judge and the jury, and their voice becomes quite literally squeezed out of the courthouse. So even if they're saying something, they're much less likely to be heard or to be heard well than they were before. Another aspect that Tim has been working on is to model the patterns of speech in the Old Bailey trial accounts. And I just want to quickly show you what he's been doing there. So within each trial account from the Old Bailey, a number of people might speak. We could have the defendant can speak, but also the lawyers, the jury, the judge, those kind of things. It'll come back into life again. And so what Tim's been doing is to kind of just quite literally visualise those different, what we call speech acts. So if we say a defendant speaking is one speech act, a jury speaking is another speech act, we can colour code those and then very simply display it in a trial. So here we have, sorry, one second. So here we have 3 trial accounts, and we have the speech acts in each of those trial accounts. We have the defendant is on the top row, witness or victim second, jury, and lawyer or judge. So how we can see how in each trial, 1, 2, and 3, how the speech differs between those 3 trials. So in the top one, the defendant says a lot. In the bottom, they say less right at the end, and then the final one, they don't say anything at all. Here we have lots of victim, witness speech, and so on and so forth. So what we can try and do then is do that for all 200,000 trial accounts in the Old Bailey. And we can see over time how the nature of what's being said at trials changes. We can see again how the defendant's speech gets pushed out of trial accounts, how they get silenced, and how it develops over time. So that's one example of an attempt to try and kind of go beyond the text, to find a part of an experiential history that's beyond the text. Another example is this one here, building Bentham's Panopticon. Has anyone heard of Jeremy Bentham and his idea for a Panopticon prison? Some nods. So the idea was that Bentham wanted to build a prison in which there's a central kind of tower in which the guard sits, and around that central tower are cells. And the idea is that the guard can always see into the cells, but then the cellmates never know if they're being watched by the guard. They can't tell if they're being surveilled or not. And the idea then was that inmates would always regulate their conduct in the same way as a surveillance camera might make you act differently. If you think you're being watched, you don't know, but if you think you're being watched, then you would act differently than if you didn't think you were being watched. So Bentham wanted to build this prison, Panopticon. The problem was that it was never built. No one ever built it to his plans. But today, thanks to digital technologies, we can in effect rebuild Bentham's Panopticon. And that's what Zoe Olker at the University of Liverpool has been doing. She's been creating a reconstruction of Bentham's plans for a Panopticon prison. And what's really interesting about this, when you build it, is that Bentham's Panopticon didn't work. There were places in the cells that the inmates could stand and the guard would never be able to see them. Likewise, if you're a guard, you can't see into the cells. So perhaps, I'll let you make your own minds up about this, but perhaps that fact, knowing that fact, changes our whole perspective of Bentham's idea. Maybe not, I think it's a point for debate, but it raises that debate if nothing else. The other thing they've been doing is they've created a virtual reality model of this, so you can actually be a cellmate in the prison and you can stand in certain positions and look and see how it would have been like. It's good fun. Okay, so overall then, this beyond the text section, what it's trying to do, suggest, is that with digital humanities we can do something else. We can access an experiential history of the past, not one that's just based on the text alone. It hopefully provides a kind of different perspective. So I hope overall then that's given you some sense of how historians of crime are using these digital methods to understand the past. I've got a quote there about, well, what difference is any of this making? Is it just another set of tools, or is it totally transforming the nature of our knowledge? Again, I'm going to leave that up to you to make your own minds up. I'd really love to know what you think about these examples, and if you feel that they are just another set of tools, or whether they are really transformative. And then the other thing that I just want to finish with is what I think is a really nice quote from Ian Gregory about the challenge of digital humanities. Where do we go from here? What should we be doing? And Ian says, the challenge for digital historians is deceptively simple. It's to do good history that combines the computer's ability to search and summarise with the researcher's ability to interpret and argue. There are plenty of sources and methods available. The challenge is to make use of them and to deliver on their potential. And I'll leave it there. Thanks very much.
So, questions? Вопросы?
This may be less of a question, more of a provocation. That I think we've been talking a lot today about open data, whether it's Frank's Magic Box or link open data. Frank's going to talk about Magic Box tomorrow. Where you were looking at those prisoners through different archives, cutting through the archives. But I think there's a real danger in doing that too. The archive makes things slower and harder, but maybe that's a feature, not a bug. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So to give you an example, I found my second project, returning to the Soviet Union, from my first project, from looking through all the archives. Right? It would never have popped out, and I'm going to work on a third project because I had to look through tons of documents that were kind of at the central level, there were summary documents. But if I'd been able to search repatriates, fraternities of the Soviet Union, and it just gave me the relevant documents from that file, I never would have found these other documents. So I'm wondering if there needs to be a differentiation in audiences, right? Because for someone, this is going to be a very useful tool, right? Especially for a student, right? Yeah. For someone who doesn't have the ability to go to all these archives. But for research, I think, at a high level, there's a real danger.
No, I completely agree. I couldn't agree more. And I think the problem with things like Ancestry and Find My Past, so those genealogy websites, is that they don't represent the nature of the archive in any form. It's really hard to find a reference, the archival reference, let alone the structure of the archive, how it's divided up. And it just presents the digital as if that's the historical record, right? That's the thing. So I think there are good examples, there are bad examples of this, and then there are good ones. And things like the Digital Panopticon try at least to have background information pages, or allow you to click through on the links so you can go to the archival record, so you can go to the catalogue, the archive catalogue for that, and see, okay, so this is where it sits within its archive, if that makes sense.
Is there the ability to, for example, you go from the sitting in that archive, right? Is the whole archive digitized?
Yeah.
So you could go to that page and then flip through that.
Yeah, and you could just browse through the archive as if it was, as if you were just there at the box looking through things.
Yeah. That allows you to do it's called side looking, right? Where you look at the sides of your top.
Yeah. So I think the good digital history projects should try and do that. They should have still that ability to see the archive as it was, as it is, and then also have that ability to cut across it at the same time. Yeah. But that's not easy, and that poses challenges, and that's not the way that that's not in the interest of something like Ancestry or Find My Past. That's costly, and they don't do it like that. So, and I think there's a challenge for us as academics to convince them that they should be doing that, to put pressure on them, even though they are commercial companies. I think there is still an imperative to do that.
Thank you very much, Richard, for a very broad perspective. For us, as a literary scholar, I have a question regarding the first part of your presentation. I mean, this distant reading of trials. Did you do, or did you register there any discursive features, discursive shifts within these trials?
Yeah, I haven't personally, but there is something online called the Old Bailey Corpus. It was produced by a guy called Magnus Huber, and he has been doing exactly that. He's been looking at the discursive features of the Old Bailey trials, and he's produced essentially a corpus that allows you to study that kind of thing. So if you Google Magnus Huber, H-U-B-E-R, Old Bailey, you should be able to find it, and I think the data is open access, so you should be able to get access to his data set, and if you're interested in doing that, you could look at how things change. And there are people that are looking at nature of dialect, how does dialect change in the Old Bailey, and those kind of things.
Thank you.
Yeah, I wonder if you also track how topics change. Maybe there are methods which have been used to different other sorts of corpora which are similar to that, like, I don't know, corpora of diaries or something, which also have this temporal extension, and maybe you can just try, I don't know, some methods like topic modeling to maybe find out something which wasn't, again, something which wasn't on the surface, but somewhere in the text you can see some undercurrents in how the judiciary process change.
Yeah, I'm sure it's possible. Yeah.
Thank you. I have a question about the API. So what you showed us, I think, was mainly front-end stuff.
Is this the which website is it? Sorry.
Sorry, the Old Bailey thing.
Yeah.
And as far as I know, it's still maintained by the DH Institute in Sheffield.
Yeah.
And it is in XML, so you could probably download the whole corpus if you preferred. But I think what makes reproducibility much easier is the API, because I think that's a move that I sense in many parts of the digital humanities, because it solves some problems that we had in the past. And do you personally work with the API, and is this something that people know and are encouraged to use? Because the problem that I see is that it's not self-explanatory, but once you have got your head around it, you can't imagine how you ever could work differently.
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the problems that they have, I think, oh, they do have it there. I think they have tried to recently make it slightly easier to work with. To be honest, I haven't done a lot of stuff with the API, because most of what I want to do, I can just do using the front end. But I think they have tried to try and make it more accessible. Yeah, well, have you had particular problems with using it? Sorry? Have you had particular issues with using it?
No, I think that without APIs, for example, there was in my field, digital media studies, there was a paper that was a rant against the whole field out of frustration that it took the scholar 2 years to get the scripts and the corpus just to reproduce them, which is one of the basic things you have to do as a scholar, falsify or try to falsify things, not only your own research but also other people's research, to be accountable for that. And out of sheer frustration, I think there was a really fierce paper written, because it shouldn't be so hard. APIs kind of solve that problem, because you don't have to download the corpus and make it, pre-process it and do this and that, so you still have to do a little bit of work, but it's much easier, and it's reproducible wherever you are, and whatever setup you have, so that's why I will talk a little bit about this tomorrow.
Okay. I think it's the kind of thing that definitely, again, if we're thinking about the difference between good digital history projects and not so good ones, is that should be a key requirement. It becomes difficult, again, when you have commercial companies that have been producing the data, is that they're clearly not going to do that, are they? Because it's not in their economic interest to do that. So, yeah. But I think certainly for publicly funded projects, it should be a kind of key requirement, really.
Questions?
Well, very short question coming from my ignorance, because as a Russian, I was just very surprised to see, or maybe I just understood something, but when you were comparing the length of trial records, were there any changes related to the fact that the form of the record themselves had changed within years? Or it was that stable that it remained the same very form used in, say, 7th century, that it survived till the beginning of the 12th century?
Yeah, essentially the nature of the overarching nature of the record stays pretty much the same throughout the whole period. Yeah, the way that they're set out tends to be very similar. It starts with the indictment, then has the evidence. The one major thing that happens is in the kind of 1730s, around about here, which is where you see this kind of spike, is that they move from third-person reporting to effectively first-person reporting. So here there's a kind of clerk summarising what happened, and then from this point onwards, it's kind of verbatim, really. It's not everything that was said at the trials. There is some stuff that is omitted, and we'll never know exactly what was omitted, but they move to that kind of more first-person style of reporting. But generally, the records stay very similar. When you look at one from 1913, it looks very similar to one from 1750, for example.
Something absolutely unusual for Russian historical students.
I mean, the argument against this is that there is no other Old Bailey online, right? It's a one of a kind. So how applicable is it to other projects? I think that's a perfectly good question. Yeah.
Other questions? So I think we're done for today. So it's another series of applause for our speaker, Richard Uorda. Yeah, and I think today's program for which is specifically DH is over. So see you all guys tomorrow. And there is also, I think, a separate event by Professor Clark, so whoever wishes to attend, feel free. It's at 6, right? Всем спасибо за участие. До свидания. And I guess we can have a lengthy coffee break now, so anyone wishes to...
We'll wait until after finished.
Thank you.
Do we need to do anything with this?
I think we should switch off the projectors, but otherwise we can just leave it.
But it's extraordinary today because it's which is probably not covered in your pain.
The way we finish that is through
But that's the whole idea. This is what which was trying to so maybe yeah, it's time for like going to zero. That is much more like I mean not much more elements, but more accessible elements. Do you see that? Like if we go to zero,